So it says now that I'm live. I hope that I finally got it right with when OBS actually starts working. But I will wait anyway for a little bit for anybody who still might want to join the stream. It doesn't matter as much. I have seen that you guys give amazing support even long after the live stream is over. Like our last few videos, we had like 300, 200, 300, almost 400 views. So yes, and it seems to be working. That's great. And I see it already starts with an amazing picture of Linus. So yeah, this is a sort of an emergency stream, primarily because I had today off and I woke up and I wanted to go to the gym, and I was like, oh, let's check something on YouTube, maybe I can pre-download something to watch while I'm running. Yeah, and then I saw this. Now, this is not a video, like, I've done some Linus reactions, like some video-wise, and I've commented a lot on something like Twitter, and there have been videos from Linus that are completely wrong, just factually completely incorrect, very poorly informed, very nitpicky in ways that just don't make much sense. This is not entirely that bad. There is one thing that I really appreciate what Linus brings to the table here, and I think it's also partially what is missing from many Apple reviewers. So this is not, I know this, it doesn't matter that I'm saying this. I don't actually hate Linus. I hate a lot of LTT content, not the people. Why would I hate them? I don't know them, right? But Linus himself always looks like a stand-up nice guy. He stands up for consumer rights. He stands up for right to repair and the things he believes in. I might not always share those beliefs, and I might have different priorities as a consumer, but I would always appreciate somebody as like Linus over somebody who's like a blind fanboy to any individual company, be it Apple or something in the PC space, Nvidia, AMD, Intel, anything you can imagine. However, this video has a lot of, like, Linus mentioned something, and we'll get to it in the beginning, about him wanting to have a positive spin on the video and not being able to do it. I struggle with how LTT does benchmarks, how much they test. Like, yes, I understand. For example, I watch a lot of PC content, believe it or not. So I love sites like Gamers Nexus, or channels like Gamers Nexus, Hardware Unbox, Hardware Canucks, and they do amazing job with testing again a few weeks later, testing a wide variety of content, testing in different settings, informing you when there are potential bugs or instabilities. LTT, especially now that they have like their big fancy lab, seems to have streamlined a lot of their processes to the point where they are stupidly simple and binary. I will get to that when we get to individual benchmarks. And whenever they test Macs, there is this absurd, I would even say like fetishization of especially 3D rendering, which I'll come out here, right? For one, I am a Mac user through and through, but Macs suck at rendering. It isn't just the fact that, for one, Macs don't yet have full hardware accelerated ray tracing, right? So that's like a 4 to 5x like downvote basically in comparison to something like an RTX, even like a 20 series, right? Which is when RTX was introduced, and like AMD's 6000 and then 7000 series. The reason why RTX was primarily introduced, besides gaming, which it never really became that successful in, at least not until now, like even games like Cyberpunk, really you don't need ray tracing. It's a giant waste of performance. Regardless, I know this isn't necessarily what Apple users care about, me lamenting about like ray tracing in Cyberpunk, but the other thing was 3D rendering, right? And yes, it's a gigantic advantage that PCs have. Just in general, though, it's not just RTX or RT. It's also the fact that a ton of like high-profile rendering applications don't even have Mac ports, much less decent Mac ports. So I fully understand if somebody comes out and says like, boy, man, sucks at like Octane, sucks at like Blender, though Blender has gotten a lot better because Apple got like personally involved. And I would say that the Blender difference, I would still say there's probably like 30-40% more performance to gain out of existing hardware. But the next big step in performance will be when Apple introduces ray tracing on their chips. Again, Apple's chips are primarily designed for mobile, so whenever they scale them up, they can add functionality. For example, ProRes was originally just for like the bigger chips, and then it came to all chips. Right, so I would assume that ray tracing, Apple could even do something similar. Maybe they could give like only an M3 Ultra, an M3 Max ray tracing cores, and then scale that down. Maybe just the A18 will get ray tracing at that point and later, or maybe it will be the entire 3 nanometer generation, right? The A17, the M3, everything else like it. So I'm not excusing Apple's poor rendering performance, and I am blabbering because I am a little angry, to be honest, though, because I'm not actually saying, and I've written that on Twitter before I made the video, right, that I am not actually interested in defending the $4,000 Mac Ultra Mac Studio, I'm sorry, the M2 Ultra Mac Studio is like just phenomenal value device. That's really not what I'm after. I personally think that it's ridiculous that it comes with 1 terabyte of storage. I think it should probably have the unbint Ultra chip at that point. Though there are clear reasons why those things cost as much as they do in terms of market pricing. Not because I'm arguing that because production costs are that high. They clearly are not. But I am arguing that when you start comparing it to something like the Pro range, right? The W series from AMD and like, I forgot what it's called on NVIDIA's side, right? They're pro graphics cards that have like 48 gigs of memory instead of 24, right? Why do I forget the name? I should know it. Let me know. If I don't remember, please let me know in the comments, right? So this is kind of where my argument always comes in. There are things where something is good in and something it's bad at. And that is perfectly fine to point out. But when you start to negate, like when you start to really contradict why people are using one specific thing for something and then something else for something else, this is where it gets a little confusing. Because yes, you can focus on this thing on like... You can basically say, oh, the hammer like isn't good for like cutting down a tree, right? But then a saw isn't good to put down a nail into something, right? It's a stupid example. I know that Macs are capable of 3D rendering, but with the current state of both the hardware and the software support, they're not that great at. And then there are those other comparisons that we'll get to. Again, I don't want to say too much up front, but I just wanted to say this is not a hate video on LTT. I fully understand why they make this type of content, for their audience, which is fair. And to the other point is because they also have like sort of their own priorities, which and interests, which I understand why then those seep into their content regardless of what device they review. Kind of how I would argue that they never made a good like iPad review, for example, because it's like, oh, one guy covers it as like this couch device where you just read, and sometimes Linus complains that it doesn't have a real file system, but then it's not cohesively put together. Maybe if they do like an M3 iPad review, I will react to that at some point. So this was a somewhat longish intro, but I really wanted to put it up front what I disagree with. And if you didn't like the points that I was making right now, and I will be making more points throughout the video, obviously, but if you thought that what I'm saying right now is like very unfair, then you can tune out, right? If you think that I'm a hater because I'm criticizing them at all, like when you look at the original thumbnail of the video, it says like, oh, like the Apple lover says you're lying, and then another guy is sending them like angry emoji. No, that's not this. I know that Linus would like it to be this. He would like it to be uninformed, and like not even Linus, but like the PCMR community. But I guarantee you that I know a lot more about PC hardware than most of you guys. I just don't care about it for myself. I'm a console player because I love the simplicity. I have helped friends build PCs. I have helped them set up PCs. I've helped them troubleshoot PCs. So my problem isn't with PCs. I just don't like them personally for myself. So I fully understand why Linus is making this video, but this is why I am making my video. So let's get started.
Really did try this time, guys. I even went as far as to ask my team if there was some positive spin that we could put on our review of the M2 Ultra Max Studio. I kind of wanted a glass half full angle before I had to dunk on the outrageously priced Mac Pro that's going to be arriving in our lab shortly.
Okay, and see, we can agree right on something at the get-go. The obligatory Coke. I do believe that the Mac Pro is overpriced. I have argued why it exists and why it could probably justify its pricing. MKBHD made a video on it and why he will be using it and why that price difference for somebody like him basically doesn't matter. And just in general, a lot of those pricing discussions kind of fall to the wayside when you start considering that we aren't really talking about like consumer focused devices. I know the Mac Studio isn't called Pro, but by all definitions it would be a Pro device in Apple's lineup. It just so happens that the Mac has an even higher ceiling device, which is the Mac Pro, which, take it or leave it, it's designed for PCIe expandability if you need it. There's the problem of like pricing, unless you're a big production house, basically like MKBHD's channel at this point. Or if you don't need it, then get the Mac Studio to still get the maximum performance. And most likely as a consumer, you are likely buying just a MacBook, right? A MacBook Air, a MacBook Pro. The market share is just such a big difference. And I know that people will always say like, oh, Apple's margins are absurdly high, and I will agree on that, for example, on things like storage, right? Or even RAM to a degree. Though again, when you compare it to like Pro devices, then like Pro tools basically, then it gets a little muddy just how overpriced it is or not. But for example, like asking $200 for the MacBook Air to have 8 gigs more RAM, like that's absurd. And I've always said that it's absurd. And I've always told people that if you look for a value device, never buy like day one there. On Amazon, you will probably get a deal where you get like the higher storage, higher RAM configuration at like at least $100 discount. And then it starts making more sense. But once we are talking about pros, and once we are talking about devices that save you times, make you money, can be written off from your taxes at least partially, and then at the end Linus does make a good point that is pro the Mac Studio, and that is just how much less energy it consumes. And for example, I live in the country where it literally is like in the top 3 most expensive energy countries in the world. So to me, that would actually make a long-term difference. That would highly differentiate it from a PC. Well, whether you're living in the US, maybe outside of California, then that might not make such a big difference to you. So yeah, it all has its pros and cons, and I do, for example, do believe that the Max Pro is overpriced for any kind of consumer. Like paying $3,000 extra just to get like PCIe expandability, if you care about that much, you should really like try having a setup where you maybe have like a MacBook if you really need a Mac, and then like a PC. That's my 2 cents on that. So I will not be reacting to that review from Linus, because I probably will be agreeing with most of it.
But we failed, and the blame falls squarely on Apple.
Yeah, I will be disagreeing with that, even though I will be partially criticizing Apple myself.
Not on the engineers. They're amazing, and Apple Silicon is a miracle of modern hardware engineering. But on the marketers, all they have...
And this is where I have start to have problems with this, which is like, yes, I understand that maybe the marketers made some mistakes, and there is one particular benchmark that I will be agreeing with Linus on. But my question with it is, sorry, just making sure that everything works. Yes, is why is your review primarily focused on a few marketing slides and not the actual product as much? So yeah, that's just like maybe something to think about, right?
Would say M2 Ultra. It's M1 Ultra, but more better.
Yes, but however, nobody buying an M2 Ultra device right now is upgrading from an M1 Ultra. Those who are doing it in like YouTube videos are doing it primarily for reviews. Their views will cover the cost of those devices. And then they make comparison to the last generation because, well, that's what they have like the most recent data for example. And probably it's the device they already have there, so it's the easiest one to compare against. However, I don't actually believe, and this might be controversial, I don't believe that gen-to-gen upgrades are a very relevant point in today's tech market. Like, yes, it's interesting from like an academic point of view, and those are the reviews that I watch myself. But as a consumer, like for example, when the iPhone 15 will come out, right? And I will be getting the 15 Ultra. And some people will be saying, oh, it might not be such a huge difference over the 14 Pro in terms of camera. Well, great, but I have a 13 Pro Max, right? What about somebody who has like a 12 Pro, right? And then they never even had ProMotion to begin with, much less ProMotion that ranges all the way down to 1 Hertz or something like that. Again, I'm making an Apple comparison here because I know that that's what my audience understands. I could just as well make an argument that like the RTX 40 series, unless you're really looking at like the 4090 at the highest end range, it's also not designed to be replacing your 30 series cards. It's much more replacement to people who have 20 series products or 10 series devices. Intel, you would never realistically upgrade from a 12900K to a 13900K. Like, sure, it has like a few more efficiency cores. How relevant it actually is in most applications is a big discussion. It certainly isn't that relevant in gaming, and then every bit of performance that you get is bought with a ton more power usage. So, right? However, if you are buying something right now, you are either buying like a really discounted last gen device or product, or a current gen because it's simply the best you can get on the market right now. It doesn't matter if it's good by itself, right? Because everybody has their own preference. There are some people who wouldn't touch Intel with like a 10-foot pole at this point because AMD is like double sufficient on the PC side. So again, it all has its pros and cons. So, and I feel like Linus's attempt at saying, oh, the only chip that M2 needs to compare with is M1. I don't know why I made him like half Italian at some point. Is the M1. M2 only needs to be compared to the M1. No. a lot of people will be coming from something like the iMac Pro, from previous generations Mac Pros, and the Mac Studio is just a one generation old device. People who bought it will not be upgrading to this, and there are also like other improvements throughout the device that I think Apple should Linus should have mentioned, but we'll get to that as the video goes on.
And we could have said, yep, sounds good. But no! Instead, they're back to their old tricks with performance claims that would get any other company sued.
That's not true. That's not true.
In this paragraph, Apple compares the M2 Ultra to the M2 Max. Then they've got these eye-catching performance claims that are floating down beneath it. Then we scroll down, more down, further, and this is where those numbers come from? They're doing it again with the unlabeled graphs and frankly, comical comparison.
Yes, I'm sorry, Linus. This is 1x. Yes, it's most likely that the one on the bottom is 1x. Like, I have no idea why that needs to exist. This is not done for obfuscation. This is done just to make it prettier. Right? And I don't need to have labels on those graphs. Because Apple is not trying to give us a comprehensive benchmark suite here across the board. So, yeah, like, what I wanted to say, what I agree with, right, is when we go back just a little bit, I agree that the placing of this paragraph, specifically with benchmark results this high, right? What does Apple compare it against in the paragraph? Like, they're mentioning the M2 Max a lot. Right, so the realistic uplift is like 2x, which it is for those things, basically. Sometimes it's a little less because of how scaling works. However, this should have been like more clearly labeled as this is a comparison to basically like the last gen iMac, or like basically the last existing Intel iMac, or something like that, right? Whatever it was in comparison to that. This is the one thing, and I've mentioned it on Twitter. I said that it's like one specific benchmark. This isn't what I meant. I meant that this specific placing of like benchmark data next to a paragraph that primarily mentions M2 Max. Oh, I actually see now that my mouse, you cannot see my mouse. It doesn't matter that much. The placing of that data next to that paragraph is wrong, and it's misleading, and Apple's website designers, marketing team do deserve criticism for that. However, that isn't a point against the actual device, nor against the core message that it is significantly faster than the last generation of sort of comparable Intel products.
Apple compares the M2 Ultra to the M2 Max. Then they've got these eye-catching performance claims that are floating down beneath it. Then we scroll down, more down, further, and this is where those numbers come from? They're doing it again with the unlabeled graphs and frankly comical comparison points.
I don't like, this is something I completely disagree with. I don't think that this is a comical comparison. You could argue that maybe it should have been like the iMac Pro. However, the single core performance of the 27-inch iMac, the last one, I believe was better, right? And then the 5700 XT isn't even that old, right? When you compare it to something that is still on the market, which is the 6700 XT, because the 7000 series still doesn't have a mid-range offering, right? It's not like the 5700 XT in compute is actually very comparable to like a PS5. So it's actually a pretty good, like in raw compute, it's like pretty good base benchmark actually. Because it's not like Apple is like providing like 50% uplifts here. The M2 Max is much more powerful. Sorry, I wanted to move like my... Why isn't it? Okay, here. Sorry, I just wanted to see. Okay, so it's the M2 Max that is 3.6 times faster already, right? So I don't quite see what is bad about being like almost 4 times faster than a desktop class graphics card in like a super small enclosure on a chip that also works in a laptop, consumes far less power, and then 6x is legitimately compute level where the 4090 sits. Like again, like you have to consider that this tests, by the way, are also like impacted by being on the Mac, right? I'm not saying that the Octane result of the M2 Ultra will match the 4090, but when you consider scaling here, because those are on the same platform, they all are running Metal, sort of, right? I mean, like Metal support on Apple Silicon is far better than it ever was on like AMD cards, but those were easier to leverage for existing developers. So again, everything has its pros and cons, right? Take a drink whenever I say that. But like that 6x increase is actually very much in line with what you would expect on the same platform. So this is what I think is like a little ridiculous, because I don't think, like, if Apple had like compared to the like the RX 580, for example, right, which was like the base configuration of the 2019 Mac Pro, which was ridiculous, and I've always said that. So I'm not above or below criticizing Apple, but the idea that it shouldn't be compared against the last pretty well received actually iMac. The biggest problem with that iMac was the fact that it happened basically around the transition to the Mac Studio to Apple Silicon. Sure, you could like get a little time out of it because before it got like legitimately like just completely uninteresting as a tech product. But yeah, you didn't want it because we all understood that there was a big transition coming at this point. So I would argue that this is a good comparison point. And even here, look, the M1 Max is freaking faster. The main comparison here is that the M2 Max even is like way faster than the M1 Ultra. And yes, they're making a question mark with the M1 Ultra. The M1 Ultra, especially in like smaller tasks, had real problems with utilization in 3D rendering. The M2 architecture fixes that to a large degree. Again, Linus will now say something that I cannot obviously vouch for myself, but I have seen some results like that where the M2 Max wins against the M1 Ultra. However, it looks like it's almost 2 times faster. So this specific benchmark is the one where I would say I'm not so sure about that. Maybe there is some mistake on Apple's part here. I have never seen one Apple benchmark that ever actively lied, so I'm not inclined to believe that this one specifically is designed to lie to consumers. But I would understand if that is like just wrong, right? That happens, and I'm not excusing it. As I said, the paragraph, the benchmark placing, it's all not okay. And if the benchmark itself is wrong, it's good that Linus is calling it out. However, we will get to further points he makes based on that I completely disagree with.
This is really misleading. They weren't comparing to M2 Max or even M1 Apple Silicon. Does Apple really think we're gullible enough to believe a 3-year-old iMac is a sensible performance reference for a professional machine? Yes, it is, because, again, this is what I've already said it, but I will say it again. That's what I profoundly disagree with. This has been part of Apple Silicon marketing from the get-go. This is part of how Apple advertises iPhones nowadays, where they will not just say, oh, like the A15 was like 20 or 30% faster than the A14, right? But they will make like a sensible comparison to something like, let's say, the A12. Which, for example, is the jump that I made, right, from the iPhone XS to the 13 Pro Max. It makes sense to have that kind of like attitude, basically, because that's how people will be actually updating.
Because imagine you are a professional who sometimes does some rendering on your Mac, right? You don't use your Mac primarily for rendering because maybe you're like a video editor who does like some small 3D clips from time to time for your video. So you get your a Mac because you love Final Cut, because you love the work that the encoders do, and you, let's say you have the last iMac that ever existed, right? So what are your options basically? Well, you could have gotten like an M1 Max MacBook, and then like an M1 Ultra Mac Studio or an M1 Max Mac Studio. But I would argue that if you really wanted like Apple Silicon, you wouldn't have waited until the Mac Studio to get like the Max chips. You would probably have gotten like the 16-inch MacBook Pro. But then you look at results on the M1 Ultra, and you see that it's not that big of an upgrade, right? So you don't upgrade to it. It's that simple. That's your power as a consumer. That's your power as a prosumer, right? So what then you do? Well, you still want to get informed on further updates from Apple Silicon. You want to know how app support is going. You want to know how powerful new generations are. And imagine, like, sure, is it good that it's like the baseline? Maybe the point should be made that it's like, oh, you should have like the M1 Max is like the baseline, and then you should have had like the last iMac with the 5700 XT and the 10-core processor is like 0.67x or something like that, right? If it's like 2/3 the performance of the M1 Max. But that is also a confusing graph to make, because most people will be like, wait, what? 0.67? Like, what? Why isn't like a 1 times 6? It's much easier to multiply for people. So, yeah, I understand why Apple made those graphs. Again, I have said time again by this point that I disagree with how it's like basically like structured their marketing page. Do I believe that it's like malicious to mention that iMac, that it's like, do you believe we're gullible enough to believe this is a sensible base point? I actually do. I kind of would have preferred the iMac Pro here, but then again, the iMac Pro isn't actually perfect in that regard. There are ways in which it's actually slower than the last iMac we got. So again, pros and cons, right?
Also, where did this number even come from? Click on any other heading, and even directly from Apple, the M2 Ultra's performance leadership looks a lot more narrow. So I think it's time to...
Yes, that's actually 100% the truth. I thought I would make like a side-by-side comparison to like MaxTech videos. Look at the videos from MaxTech, from like Vadim Yuriv and his brother. You will see that 3D rendering is one of the things that has improved the most. M2 chips have a little more cache, so they're better at like packaging like individual tasks of rendering, but by itself that isn't what changes. But then specifically on the Ultra, again, that's a speculation in the Apple community. It's that how the packaging basically works in like the data chunks that are sent between the chips, that it's apparently much larger now. I still haven't seen how large exactly it's supposed to be. So I will not be making a concrete point here, just like... it's a speculation that has its rooting in a very real factual reality. Very real factual reality. Wow, that's a mouthful and stupid to say. But, and that point is simple. It's that 3D rendering is the thing that has been the most improved from the M1 to the M2, and the M2 Ultra scales far better to the M2 Max than the M1 Ultra did to the M1 Max. You might not be able to always get the same results. Again, it will depend on what exact rendering workload do you have. And Linus will also say it. Will be like, well, just how much does it like leverage absurd amounts of potential memory? All of it plays a role. However, saying that basically, oh, this result is absurd, it's actually not. I do struggle sometimes when they're saying that the M2 Max is legitimately much faster than the M1 Ultra, because everything that I have seen is like it about matches the M1 Ultra, and for the most part it's like maybe even 10-20% faster in like rendering, and then 10-20% slower in like many other tasks. So again, I cannot guarantee if like Octane maybe does something very specific. Maybe Apple used like some kind of pre-release version. They do mention on their website though that it's that there wasn't anything special about it. But yeah, so who knows? Again, I'm not against calling giving some criticism, but Linus just showed like actual leads where it's like 5x faster, and it's like, oh, but like 6x is absurd. I'm like, okay, so, like this is like a 20% difference in like percentages. It's not that absurd.
Roll up our lab coats, cut through the marketing, read the fine print, and figure out what Apple is trying to
The
hide.
fuck you wearing, man?
And hide from our sponsor.
Ugreen, do you need some on-the-go juice? The Ugreen.
No, I hate you, Green.
Externally, the new Mac Studio is identical to its predecessor, right down to its total weight. And that means that everything I have to say about it concerns what's under the hood. You've got substantially more bandwidth for displays than the previous generation, to the point where it greatly exceeds what a single GPU PC can handle. Plus, you get Apple's upgraded Wi-Fi 6E module with support for Bluetooth 5.3 and the 6 GHz Wi-Fi band. Since it's the same Wi-Fi E module that's found in M2 MacBooks, that makes for a maximum transfer rate that is double that of last gen, should your wireless router support it, of course. The stars of the show, however, are the upgraded M2 based.
Okay, so I was a little wrong. Linus did mention those things. I do believe that it's worth like really sometimes even like testing it. Because when he's like saying, oh, it exceeds like the output of like the RTX 40 series, for example, I do believe that sometimes it's just worth like looking, oh, how many monitors does it support? That's the kind of stuff that I would actually be legitimately interested in from Linus. Or if they have like a Wi-Fi 6E router, maybe they could do some speed comparisons. A lot of like Windows Windows PCs have like Wi-Fi 6E, but it's not always been like the best performing from everything that I've heard. So I would have actually liked to see, like, not because the chipsets themselves are bad, like Intel Wi-Fi modems are actually really good, but like with how PCs are set up, I would like to see like maybe that Apple does have like some problems with the aluminum enclosure. Does Wi-Fi penetrated really well, right? The Mac Mini was like notorious for having, for example, some Bluetooth connectivity issues because of that. So again, Apple does deserve some criticism sometimes, and I do like tests that prove, oh, Apple has improved something, oh, something got worse, oh, Apple once again didn't address it. So I do like that they mention it, but it's kind of weird that they don't do anything with it. Like even like MaxTech made a full video where he like made comparison with like Wi-Fi 6E and what it means for the latest Macs, and I do believe that Linus definitely has the capacity to test it, though again, Linus probably just uses 10 gigabit Ethernet.
M2 Max is the same SoC that's found on the MacBook Pro 14 and 16, while M2 Ultra is only available on the desktop Mac Studio and the Mac Pro. It's the most powerful silicon that Apple can build, and ours is the most powerful version of it, with 24 CPU cores and 76 GPU cores, which is not a massive improvement on paper next to our M1 Ultra Studio.
It doesn't need to be, right? It's like it took like a little over a year between updates. When you compare like a card like the 4060 Ti versus the 3060 Ti, it's the same price and sometimes delivers worse results. So it's not like PCs are universally known to always have like amazing jumps in performance gen to gen on every price configuration. But again, when you're actually seeing some of the results, some of the very specifics, for example, and we will get to that in like video rendering, there's a lot of stuff missing from from what Linus is doing, and I highly encourage that you do check out other channels, including something, by the way, like a PC channel, like Hardware Canucks, which has done a far better job in reviewing the latest generation of Apple processors. Far better, and just in general, everything they do is far better than LTT, in my opinion. But whenever they cover Apple, for example, why does Linus, or Linus Media Group at this point, right? Linus isn't even the CEO anymore. Why does Linus Media Group have an Apple channel, but then does their Apple reviews on their LTT channel? Why is this has been like one of the first videos that I made, which is like saying that like Linus shouldn't make an Apple channel, and he did, but he just refuses to put good content on it, including this. Like, I would argue, yes, of course, this video will get much more traction from a huge channel like LTT. But if you ever wanted your Apple channel to become successful, that's the kind of content you should be putting on it, not on LTT.
Since the memory bandwidth and ultrafusion fabric that connects the two dies together.
Yes, memory bandwidth is the same. It's a shame. LPDDR5X, like something in the 8,000 range is still not very accessible. Like in the quantities, and especially like the desktop level performance that Apple needs. I would fully expect the M3 generation to have faster memory, or maybe even like redesigned buses to go along with it. However, this is also partially exactly the point for the PC side. The RTX 4090 has the exact same memory bandwidth when we just look at bus plus the speed of the GDDR6X memory. What changes is the amount of cache, and cache does help along with effective bandwidth. So this is also what's happening here.
Is the same as last gen, but with the extra cores also comes higher clock speeds, both for the CPU and the GPU, which according to Apple gives the M2 Ultra over double the 3D rendering performance compared to last gen. This is achieved in large part by the move to TSMC's enhanced N5P manufacturing process, which makes...
Not really. N5P is like 5 to 10x, oh my god, 5 to 10% like more efficient than N5. It's not that big of a deal. Apple just, like, yes, you could argue Apple achieves pretty much the same power consumption. It's actually a little higher. Even though they have higher clock speeds because they're on a new node. However, when you actually break down something like an Antax, like A15 and later than A16 reviews, you will actually find that efficiency is clearly ahead unless you really like fully leverage all cores, right? It's better than just the improvement that you would get from N5P. So there are architectural things that are more impressive here.
It's the die denser and more energy efficient. So far, so good then. But as soon as we tried to replicate Apple's performance claims, things went south faster than a gamepad-controlled submersible headed for the... Too soon. Oh, sorry. Things went bad.
Yeah,
let's start with their deeply suspicious Octane X render performance. The x-axis on their graph isn't labeled, but we can infer from the numbers that are listed that the M2 Ultra should be about 3 times faster than the M1 Ultra. That is not what we found, nor is it what this user from the Otoy forums observed. We had some ideas, like maybe our test was too short, and a longer, higher resolution render would give the new Ultra more time to spool up and flex its muscle. But that didn't pan out either. And come to think of it, why would it? Apple doesn't even claim to have done a complete architectural overhaul here. The new GPU got some more cores and a faster clock speed. And when we click on 3D interaction, another GPU-bound test, we see a much more realistic generational bump. So what is going on here? Truthfully, we're still not sure. What we know is that it almost certainly has to do with the unspecified project that Apple used to generate their numbers. What we don't know is exactly how they managed to create a perfect storm of conditions to support these numbers. One idea we had was it could be that the project is larger than 128 gigs, which is the maximum amount of unified memory that's supported by the previous generation Apple Silicon.
I'm not distracted. I'm actually trying to find something. Cinnabon. I'm trying to see what like. There it is. It's not Octane, but it's. Where is it? I mean, scrubbing through YouTube can be a pain. Okay. I actually have found something, and that is Blender, BMW from MaxTech, right? And they actually have a result where the M2 Ultra, that isn't even like the fully configured one. Right, I will show it here. I do know it's not great in focus, right? Okay, yeah, now you should see it. So I will just say it. It's the 60-core M2 Ultra that isn't like the fully configured. Again, the fully configured is like it's like over 70 cores, right? Isn't it like 78? I'm sorry, guys. I don't want to say anything wrong because it's just text. I'll just. Okay, so it's a 60-core GPU that goes. Yes, it starts with the 60-core GPU and can be configured with 76 cores. Yes. I'm sorry. So the 60-core M2 Ultra beats out the 64-core M1 Ultra, which was the previous generation fully configured version. Okay, now we are on track here. By double. It's literally twice as fast. It takes 11 seconds versus 22 seconds. Now imagine you have something that delivers potentially, if it scales really well, if it has 16 more cores, right? That's a lot in this case. That's like 15 would be like 25% more, so it's like a little over 25% extra cores. That's pretty much exactly what would result in 3x the performance of the previous generation M1 Ultra. If you then add a few small bottlenecks, like maybe something that occasionally spills out of 128 gigs of memory. Again, this is not Octane, this is Blender, but it's a rendering software. Yes, that's exactly what is happening, and I know that sometimes like Octane is not very well optimized for Apple Silicon, and I'm not even saying that to blame the Octane developers. Why would they really optimize? That's not where their user base is. But a 3x improvement over the M1 Ultra is absolutely possible. And in a maybe something that is like highly GPU limited, maybe something that previously didn't scale at all because like communication issues with between the two between the Max chips, you could get to that performance level. I don't for a second believe that Apple's results here are in any way like maliciously manipulated. They might be higher than the average benefit. However, Blender BMW is actually like a super low effort test that happens to take up very little time. So, and you could still see scaling there. So, yeah, I do not believe that we are seeing evil results from Apple on that front. Sorry, it took me a while to find what I was looking for. I know it looked like a little hectic, but I do really like this live reaction format because it makes it feel authentic, right? You live, basically, you get to know what I know, what I don't know, like how I react to certain things. So I don't like the artificial nature of like preparing a video a lot and like making like 10 recordings and finding the best ones. It's amazing for like production quality, and obviously I do want like MKBHD's videos to stay like that, but my content is this, so I hope you can live with sometimes me being a little disheveled and disorganized. This doesn't happen often.
Pushed the project out of RAM, that would have severely hampered M1 Ultra's ability to keep up. And that would have hampered our test machine too, since we didn't spring for the full 192 gigabyte config. But then that still doesn't explain their M2 Max numbers, since that machine was configured with 96 gigabytes of memory. All we can say for sure right now then is that the improved GPU performance is clearly very dependent on what exactly the GPU is crunching away at. And even in this case, it doesn't hold a candle to an RTX 4090, which completes
that is completely true. And I have always said, if you want something that is the best bang for the buck for rendering, you would get like an NVIDIA GPU, not even an AMD GPU. Because when you look at like a 7900 XTX in similar test, even though it has like around 85 to 90% of the raw compute, it will often be like half as fast.
Render at the maximum resolution available in just 3 seconds. Ouch. Okay, well what about other 3D rendering suites, like Redshift then? Here the M2 Ultra looks like it's doing about how you'd expect against both its predecessor and its little brother M2 Max. But again, when we add the PC into the equation, we can see why Apple didn't want to invite these comparisons. That's about the same degree of demolition as we saw in Octane, with the M2 Ultra managing just under 30% of the 4090's performance potential. But Linus, you might say, that's unfair. The RTX 4090 is overpriced. It costs $1,600 US, and that's true. But the GPU in the M2 Ultra costs more than that. It costs whatever Apple included in the base config pricing, plus $1,000.
Yes, I've always said Apple's devices are not meant for like maximum bang for the buck, and certainly not in 3D rendering. It's valid criticism if you try positioning it as like a hobbyist like Blender or like Redshift or Octane work horse. It is not suited for that as a great value device. However, if you are buying a Mac, for example, for code compilation, for video editing, for photo editing, just for usage throughout Mac OS because that's your preferred operating system, even through like AI acceleration in like a way that is like very energy efficient, for example, like all of those tasks are great. And then you have to consider, or if you just want something compact that maybe is like a production workhorse that like you can actually take along with you, but you can try it with like a 4090 PC, but then you also end up still having less memory actually for your tasks. You end up with far higher power consumption to the point where you might not even be able to use it outside realistically with on battery packs and stuff like that. So yes, I am fully aware that the value here isn't fantastic, and for example, I have always argued that this upgrade shouldn't even exist because Apple should be using the highest quality Max chips to make the Ultra. We don't need bint Max chips to make the Ultra. Bint Max chips are fantastic for MacBooks and even for like the low-end Mac Studio. They don't need to be part of the Ultra. So again, I fully agree with the value idea here, but it doesn't exist in a vacuum. That's what I'm trying to say. Like, as people can write off devices from their taxes, they're billing their customers. If they're like a professional photo editor for like weddings and stuff like that, or well, that's a little low key, but like let's say you're a professional photo editor for like supermodels and stuff like that, you're most likely billing your customers part of the machine basically as whenever you upgrade. That's part of pro workflows and pro financing. Like Linus knows this himself, although he probably gets a ton of his hardware for free at this point. But there is a legitimate difference where Apple wants that $1,000 because they can ask for it. And when you actually look between the 60 core and the 76 core, yes, there is like a solid difference between them, but the one above stuff has like the full 24 core CPU already. So if you are getting something primarily for CPU tasks, then you might not even care whether you're getting a 60 core or 76 core GPU. You're also getting the full 32 core neural engine. You're getting all the media engines. So you might not always need that extra GPU oomph, and that extra GPU oomph is exactly the difference only in rendering, right? Only the GPU difference is what we see in rendering. We don't see all the things that are equal between those models: the CPU, the neural engine, the media encoders. So yes, it's not great value, but there's a reason why Apple can ask that price, and because pros most often will not care about that difference at that point.
To upgrade it to the best config, the one that we're using. Okay, how about Blender then? Version 3.5 added an official metal renderer that promises a major speed up. And yeah, it's fast. Like, this data from our M1 Ultra review is a little old now, but if we slot our new numbers in, we're seeing nearly RTX 3090 levels.
Again, I don't know why the Cycles GPU renderer, okay, metal. Like, this is not, like, I have seen far better results than this. Okay, so we do have, like, I will move my video around a little bit here. I'm sorry. Yeah, okay, so BMW actually shows pretty much the exact results. Sorry guys, I'm not trying to be an ass, but like, yeah, okay, here. So it's like a BMW Classroom Junk Shop. Okay, so we do have pretty much scaling of 2x, but we do also have better results from other sites. So I cannot guarantee how concrete this is. Like, if there maybe are like changes between like the second to last and the absolutely latest Blender version, right? So I will, and I cannot make those comparisons myself, so I will be actually interested to see what will happen in like another month or two once most, like the M2 Ultra launched, I would say, with a few like bugs in terms of how third-party support is handled. There are some apps in which it's worse than the M1 Ultra, so I will be interested to see just how fully leveraged it becomes, like once it's out for a few weeks, once it's out for a few months. So now I'm moving my head up again, and I hope that I can keep it there from now on. I'll also make it a little smaller. So.
Lots of raw GPU compute power here. Though, again, depending on the scene, M2 Ultra's best showing is still trumped by the ray tracing cores on the RTX 4090, and even gets beat by the card's slower CUDA renderer.
Yeah, this is where we get into optimization, because CUDA by itself is like, with the long history of like CUDA on PC, with the long history of Blender on PC, this is an optimization difference. Like, even look at something, the difference between the M2 Max and the M1 Ultra. Like, that, this is not a realistic difference. Yes, the M1 Ultra had like some scaling issues, but not as bad. So the RTX 4090 on CUDA being half as fast as with ray tracing, that's actually a surprisingly small difference. Does really not utilize any ray tracing at when they say CUDA? Regardless, so with CUDA it's still like twice as fast as the M2 Ultra. That is an optimization difference. When you look at raw compute, those cards are not that far removed from each other. And anybody who tries to say that and then tries to say like, oh look, this is the performance of a 4070 without ray tracing. Sure, if you're looking at tasks that have been like optimized for decades on PC and barely are now getting some decent support on Mac, then yes, I agree. Do I think that it's a valid comparison for anybody, for like the vast majority of Mac users? No, I don't.
So then, maybe Apple meant CPU-based 3D rendering in their claims?
No, CPU-based 3D rendering will be like what, 20%
I
faster?
didn't focus on that, but sure, let's talk about it. Compared to the M1 Ultra,
Oh my god, I have
it's
to
about
move
as
my
fast as
face
you'd
again.
expect
I'm
with
so
extra core
sorry.
efficiency cores and a bit more clock speed. Then compared to a Core i9-13900K PC, well, it's about that much slower. Still, I mean, it's a pretty impressive showing considering that it's fairly apples to apples in terms of core count against that Intel chip. And that's a pattern that continues when we hit it with synthetics, like Geekbench 6, where single-threaded performance is about 90% of what the i9 can do, but multi-threaded performance is more or less on par, if not faster. And we see a bit more of that it depends performance with Geekbench's GPU test, where OpenCL is about where our previous results were, but Metal is actually higher than what the RTX 4090 is capable of.
Yes, and I would actually say that this is where synthetics are bad, regardless. For one, I think it's weird that Vulkan is like I have to move my face again. It's like 115,000 points worse on the 4090 than OpenCL. Like, that's absurd, by the way. Anybody who knows the history of OpenCL, it's a tragedy how Apple basically birthed it and then forgot it. But yeah, like the Mac Studio matches with its metal results, the results of Vulkan on the 4090, while its OpenCL tests are basically like 2.5 times faster, even 2.5 times slower than the OpenCL results on the 4090. That should just tell you that like synthetics are actually very interesting when it comes to stuff like API support, when it comes to optimization, to just get a glimpse of just how different and how absurdly different sometimes results are. Well, you could probably make the point that like the way Vulkan addresses it here and the way Metal addresses it here, that those are probably the actual like compute levels between those chips, right? Should Metal and Vulkan be higher than OpenCL? Yeah, they absolutely should. But ironically, like the low-level APIs here are doing a better job. So it should show you that it is not like a raw, like purely scientific comparison that you are making when you're trying to say, oh, like Blender, like rendering in general is like a really good way to test it. Not really, certainly not on Mac.
This highlights two very important things. First, that optimization is king, and second, that you cannot rely on a single benchmark to determine what your real-world performance will be, even if that benchmark happens to be derived from a real-world workload.
That's amazing, and this is where I would say like Linus is so much better than many of the people working for him, which is he provides a lot of nuance. And I think most people who are doing the testing do like the hot take nature that you can derive from it. And Linus gets to insert like one or two sentences that are like super based, like super like smart and super nuanced. But then the rest of the review continues on with the hot take.
You've got to have a full suite. For an example in the other direction then, Cinebench. While it is an Apple Silicon native app, Cinebench is a notoriously Intel-optimized benchmark.
It's actually not just Intel optimized, but like AMD optimized their like core architecture to be better in Cinebench because like in Cinebench, the actual benchmark, not even like in Cinemax like 4D or 3D, I always forget what it's called. specifically because they knew that people were like using Cinebench as maybe even a deciding factor between what CPUs to buy. So ironically, they just ended up optimizing for it, but like real world results, sure, AMD chips are great, by the way, I'm not downplaying it, but we saw like gains in Cinebench over the last few generations that don't happen to fully reflect like the average upgrade that you get in most apps. So and Apple didn't do jack shit for Cinebench because they don't care, and the Cinebench people certainly don't care. Like, they've upgraded it once for Apple Silicon, never again, not for a new generation, nothing, not for like ultra chips or anything. I believe they are like updates, like micro updates where it like recognizes the hardware better. There's absolutely nothing here where you would be like, oh, but it's like it's based on the app. Well, guess what? Then the app is also like the core, like Cinemax, or I always forget what it's called. I'm sorry. It's like then it's shit on Mac too, and then you shouldn't use a benchmark that uses an app that isn't even used by Mac users, right? This is like if you made like even Geekbench, for example. I have repeatedly said that I don't care about Geekbench results, and for example, on something like the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, I have repeatedly said that I don't care that the A16 is technically like 25% faster in like single core performance or anything. If real world results are pretty much identical, I don't care. There are things where the A16 will be like twice as fast sometimes because of just how optimized apps are and how much better Metal is than like OpenCL, and just how bad Vulkan is on Android. And those are the real world results that I will point out to still say that Apple delivers a much faster on average experience. Again, gaming is also different, but then again, gaming, I don't game much on my phone, and the things that I play on are actually not available on Android. I primarily play Apple Arcade stuff, but that's a very different discussion from today. So what I'm trying to say is, like, it's very great that Linus calls it out, but he should have also called it out with like Octane and stuff like that, because he's like, oh, Blender has like support now for Apple Silicon. It's still not super deep in comparison to like the literal years and years of support that it's been optimized for a PC, and especially CUDA. Right, even if you were to use like an AMD chip in comparison, you would see something that sits probably like between those things, but not because the AMD cards are so much slower, but because they haven't been as optimized for as NVIDIA cards.
That hasn't yet been updated with Cinema 4D's Apple Silicon optimizations.
It hasn't yet been updated. I don't yet even know if those... okay, the app is Cinema 4D. It's not Cinemax 4D. I don't know why I thought it was called that. That's actually the theater that I go to. Regardless, yeah, so it's an unoptimized app. Shouldn't be used at all for like cross-operating system comparisons.
So, while we are seeing okay scaling between our Apple chips, Intel absolutely dominates here. Again, this isn't something that we saw in real-world workloads, and shows you how important benchmark selection can be, whether you're trying to paint a narrative about your own product or a narrative about a competitor's.
But that's exactly what you did. You took benchmarks and you took something where you couldn't replicate Apple's results, which, fine, okay, that happens. As I said, there are some results that do point towards far better scaling than what you have been able to replicate. Maybe there is some bug in like the official release version of Octane that wasn't present while Apple was testing. Maybe Apple implemented some specific fix. Maybe it was something very specific to the rendering workload that they were running, but it's definitely possible. Right, it's not completely out of the blue, and I think that Blender, which is far more optimized than Octane, does show that that kind of scaling is possible. But you have said it yourself that you can create narratives with like whatever your benchmarks you're using, and the fact that you were like Octane, Redshift, Blender, and then we get to like synthetics like Geekbench and to a degree Cinebench, right? You are already doing something very specific here when it comes to creating narratives, which, sure, your primary narrative was to dispel Apple's marketing claims. Don't think you, like, I think you provided your own data points, and that is very much welcome. And I have fully agreed with things like saying that the way that, like, the website is laid out is, like, misleading. I have disagreed with points about saying that the iMac is not a valid comparison point. I don't agree with that. So you do still create your own narratives, which is fine. We all have our biases, but it's very clear that your bias against, like, Apple's marketing supersedes your neutrality towards the actual product.
Let's look at another of Apple's chosen benchmarks then. Color grading. Apple's using DaVinci Resolve Studio here, and the test sequences...
Why is this... Huh? Am I stupid? Let me go back.
Color grading.
Color grading. 3D... Okay, so I will move my face for a little bit. So they chose, like, color grading in DaVinci Resolve. So, but video processing, video editing, 3D interaction, video transcoding, and code compiling, they skipped in this order. I do know that they will cover code compiling, but we will get to that too. I do have some problems with the way they cover that.
Apple's using DaVinci Resolve Studio here, and the test sequence is a 28-second ProRes project with noise reduction. Last time I checked, that's not really what color grading means. So our project then is 4 minutes of mixed 4K and 8K Blackmagic RAW and Red RAW clips with actual HDR color grading.
Yeah, so that looks like maybe like a mix-up on the website. I think maybe that should have been on just the video editing section, though I think what Apple meant here, and that is like brevity is like the enemy of nuance sometimes, which is they should have said it's like color graded project, right? They shouldn't have said that it's like color grading by itself, but it's like the video editing of a color graded project.
And denoising. And I'm starting to feel a bit like a broken record here, but the PC is faster.
Okay, and this is a very valid point. However, it cannot exist in a vacuum. What is even like... Again, like now we are lacking data here. I will go back a little bit. I'm sorry.
Our project then is 4 minutes of mixed 4K and 8K Blackmagic RAW and Red RAW clips with...
Okay, Blackmagic RAW and Red RAW, which is interesting because didn't Linus switch to like Sony cameras a while ago from like their red cameras? It doesn't matter. Red cameras are absolutely a valid use case. They're used by many high-end professionals.
Actual HDR color grading and denoising. And I'm starting to feel a bit like a broken record.
Oh, they actually use like encoders here. Once again, I have to move my face. It's like H265 and ProRes. That's weird. Why would those tasks be exactly the same? Like, is DaVinci Resolve, does it have some kind of bottleneck? That's so weird. Like, look, I understand that like encoders work the way they work and sometimes, but like everything that I know about Apple's, like they do have double the ProRes encoders, and they do scale now better than they did on the M1 Ultra, but like did they all have the exact same speed? That's very weird. Like, is it maybe bottlenecked by some of the film grading and denoising? I actually don't know. And also, this is a benchmark, right? We should also, part of the actual user experience of a pro is how smooth was the playback during the project, how smooth was the scrolling through the playback, did it ever stutter, did it ever like hang up, and if you're using, and we will get to that if they don't do it.
But the PC
Like,
is
I'll
faster.
comment on it.
And for whatever reason, our M2 Ultra machine, far from being 50% faster like Apple claims, ended up running slower than our...
Okay, so now you so you now clearly have a somewhat bugged app that hasn't been updated fully, which is fine, right? It's absolutely fair to say that that's on Apple. They should be like testing the most popular applications. But now look at this, right? If you actually look at this, the M1 Ultra versus the RTX 4090, they're super close. When you compare like the differences through every other test, which this has like 30, like the M2 Ultra has like objectively 20% more CPU performance, 30% more GPU performance. In some cases where it can really utilize the cache and scale better, it will often be like 50 or even 60% faster. And in some highly newly optimized workflows, it will be 2 to 3 times faster, like rendering. Again, still not as fast as CPC, but whatever. But like, I don't get, like, this is weird for DaVinci Resolve, because I kind of would expect ProRes to be faster in general, and there clearly is is like a bottleneck here across the board. So it's weird to me. Like, also they could have tested like AV1 as an alternative on the 4090 series. Then I would actually have like a better, like more scientific kind of approach, because the AV1 is something that Apple's chips cannot do yet, and ProRes is something that those chips cannot do, like with the help of encoders.
M1 Ultra machine. This has to be some kind of bug. Maybe something kind of like what we saw with the game porting toolkit video, where we used M1 Ultra Silicon because it was what we happened to have, and it turns out it's totally bugged and performance was way lower than it's supposed to be. But then, in this case, we went out of our way to test with Resolve Studio 18.5 beta, just like Apple did. We tried changing the export parameters.
Okay, so you see. So my points are actually quite valid when it comes to like version selection and stuff like that. So there seems to be some kind of problem here.
We just got the same results every time. All I can guess is that because this is beta software, maybe something broke in between Apple doing their testing and me doing mine. So
Yes.
Apple, I know you've got my digits. If you want to help us look into this, hit
No,
me up. And
they don't
guys,
care.
We'll pin a comment if we hear back from them and get this resolved. Pun intended. What's left?
Yeah, I'm fine with saying Blackmagic replicated our results. It's good that they contacted them, but that just points to the fact that like the latest release they have does have this problem. And there also should be noted that like macOS Sonoma is coming up, big even more updates to like Metal are coming out as always. There's things that throughout how Apple handles their software. I know it sucks, and I'm not telling you to buy a Mac in summer and then wait for like fall to get like the latest version. But this is usually where we will get like updates also from third-party apps, because they will be like re-optimized for us. Now Sonoma, or previously like whatever other version was new. That what happens even with something like Parallels, right? Like it's not like the developers of Parallels are lazy and do not care about performance optimizations, but if you're doing one big update a year, why wouldn't you want to coincide it with the latest macOS release? So this is not an excuse, this is just context. I would be saying the same thing for like, I've criticized, okay, this is a good example. I know nobody will care who already hates me and calls me an Apple sheep, but like when Intel's chips with efficiency cores came out, like the 12 series, sites like channels like Gamers Nexus originally didn't want to test it with Windows 11 or Hardware Inbox, I don't remember which one it was, because the vast majority of the install base was on Windows 10. But the way those efficiency cores work is they obviously have to communicate deeply with the operating system, and the hardware scheduler, or like more precisely like the software scheduler in this case because it's from the operating system, was like far more optimized for it on the newer Windows 11 than on the older Windows 10. So what was the problem? Well, but people use Windows 10 on, I don't know. But like Windows 11 was available, but then you could also say like things like macOS Sonoma is available if you wanted to, right? If you are testing one beta version, you might as well test another beta version at this point. So, again, this is not an excuse. I am saying that I do expect most apps to come in line with what Apple has shown, whether it's like, again, those devices launched like last month, so it's not like it's been that long. And the Ultra chips do suffer from like different optimization requirements. This is not the same as just like going from like, it has a few more extra compute cores, it clocks a little higher. All of that is also true for the Ultra chips, but because the communication layer is there, I would argue that you would probably need like your annual update. By at this point, it's pretty clear. I do expect like the M3 generation to like fuck up a lot in the beginning, for example, with like more obscure third-party apps, not Apple's own stuff. So yeah, that's my point here, that like I agree with Linus actually that like something broke between when Apple tested it and between when they tested it. However, you do have alternatives to DaVinci Resolve, and DaVinci Resolve is not even close to the most popular video editing application. It's definitely not the most popular video editing application on the Mac. So why wouldn't you then test it against Final Cut Pro to see how that compares, how that scales, and how you maybe even compare it to something like Logic Pro, no, not Logic Pro, I'm so sorry, Premiere. Premiere is a garbage application that crashes, that is slow, that doesn't work as well as either DaVinci Resolve or Final Cut, but that's what a lot of professionals actually have to use. They were trained on it, their production houses work on it, so their colleagues use it, so they, in order to share projects, they have to use it. So why not use that to say, this app has a bug? And clearly they would at least likely match the PC here if it wasn't for like this bug. So how does it behave on other applications that do very similar things? And this is a big shortcoming of this video.
Then. How about code compiling? Apple used...
So now we are jumping to code compiling, a CPU task. We clearly skipped a lot of stuff from things that Apple mentioned, which could have been used as reference points to say, maybe it's not malicious, maybe it's just this one specific thing that either they got wrong, or maybe that a release version of maybe macOS broke something for those kinds of apps.
Open source project built with Xcode. Thanks. Very reproducible, Apple. So
it doesn't matter. Like, code scales pretty well. Like,
we used Chromium, and whatever Apple was compiling, we are just not seeing the M2 Ultra getting double the performance of the M2 Max.
Really? Wait. Video capture. Moving away.
Though the M1 Ultra number does look like it's in the ballpark just by eyeballing the bar graph lengths. Apple does manage to outperform Intel here.
Yeah, so wait, but it's like 80% faster. Like, what do you mean? It's not double, but it's very close to double when it comes to that. And yeah, Chromium. Oh my god. It's like come on, like LTT, I know you want to use like benchmarks that you know from PC, but like even like MaxTech is not like a production, like a big production house with like dozens of employees. But what they did is they reach out to like actual developers, got themselves an Xcode project, and see how it scales. And yes, the scaling here is actually pretty decent. And yes, it's actually faster than PC, right? So where's the complaint here? But like, and then you always use Chromium. Fine, use
That
Chromium.
could be partly down to the build target. Apple didn't specify whether they were targeting Apple Silicon or x86 on.
But I don't see the problem with what is shown here. Again, I'm moving it here. It's like, so it's 3 times faster than the 5700 XT. Between 1.8 and 3.6 is an 80% difference, which is around what we saw. We see a slightly larger gap, I would argue, than we saw between the M1 Ultra and M2 Ultra, but that will depend a little bit on the project. And then the M1 Max scales here really well with the M2 Ultra. The M2 Max scales pretty well with the M2 Ultra. I don't see any problem here. Like, what is Linus being about here?
Mac, so we just built native for each platform, just like we built our.
Yeah, that's fine. I would always like. Why wouldn't you build native?
Sounds pretty bad for Apple then.
Really? You just showed that they're winning against the 13900K in an actual workflow. Wait, did I get something wrong? Like, what was bad was rendering, and then you tested one video application that was clearly bugged, and you didn't do anything to test Final Cut or Premiere even, which if you wanted to do like really good like cross-platform comparison, okay, do Premiere, though again, people on Mac use Final Cut, and if you want to make a legit comparison, actually, and also when you sometimes compare it, DaVinci Resolve will sometimes export faster, but then like the inline video editing performance will be much better in Final Cut. So those like differences in export speed will matter far less to actual video professionals. And the thing you are doing here, you're trying to reduce an actual like professional complex workload to one aspect of it, which is the last moment, which is the exporting. And then you're trying to downplay the achievements of what 80% of like the workflow actually will be impacted by. Again, and there are some actual benchmarks out there where people test like the 4080, the 4090 against those Apple chips, and you will see far better in like video editing performance that isn't just exporting. So,
Like we built our screwdriver, available at lttstore.com. So
oh, okay, and I wanted to see that right here.
Apple didn't specify whether they were targeting.
Where is it?
Though the M1 Ultra number does.
Sorry. The scrolling on OBS is abysmal. It's just not large enough to do.
The M2 Ultra getting.
Okay, so where's the
performance of
PC?
M2 Max. Though the M1 Ultra number does look like it's in the ballpark just by eyeballing the bar graph lengths. Apple does manage.
Okay, there's the PC. So I don't get it. It's faster. Like everything we've shown thus far isn't that good. It's faster.
Perform Intel here though, but that could be partly down to the build target. Apple didn't Mac, so screwdriver available then. And as far as their shady marketing is concerned, it very much is. But there's an elephant in the room that we haven't talked about yet, and that's power. In our
okay, and this is where it gets good because they cover something important, but it gets really bad because somehow the benchmarks stopped. Right, you did one code compilation test, okay, because clearly it wasn't going into your favor. So you did like 3 rendering workloads because those are different applications, but like one test is enough for a code compilation, okay. Their Macs are used for a large degree for audio workflows. They have like super superior latency to PCs because Unix is better than than whatever the foundation of Windows is for that. I always forget. The point is that there are workloads here that Mac users are targeting that you are completely ignoring. Photo editing. Apple mentioned photo editing. What happened with like a Lightroom test or something like that? Or even Photoshop, again, if you really wanted to go like super classic, right, like an Adobe app, where is that? And I'm not even saying that Macs would the Mac would always win in it, but I'm like, why isn't it here? This, like, it's an 18-minute video. It's made by one of the largest tech channels in the world. Why does it have less reviews than channels do that have like 100,000 subscribers? Why am I willing to clearly invest more time into the, like, deconstructing this video than like probably like 3 people who worked on this review clearly did in benchmarking it? And now we get to energy consumption, which is a very big positive for Mac, for the Mac Studio, but
we observed power consumption that never pushed beyond 227 watts for the entire box. However, while we had a pretty good CPU stressor at the time, we didn't have a great way of stress testing the GPU. But now that Blender has a metal renderer, we can give it a bit more of a workout. Do bear in mind, of course, that this is a worst case scenario. And it's pretty impressive. It looks like the total power from the wall peaks at around 331 watts.
Like, they do like those super detailed, like, who the hell tests power consumption at like different temperatures? That's like great. So why wasn't the same? It's clearly because they test those things at their new lab, and they have like automated processes to like change temperature and then measure the wattage. So, but you still have to do work that isn't automated.
Which, real talk, guys, either a Core i9 or an RTX 4090 could draw on its own. Sometimes even more.
It's not just sometimes. The 4090, you can undervolt it to get like very decent results. You're likely better off just capping it at like 350 watts so it never spikes to 450. It will save you a ton of energy. Or you're better off just capping the performance at like 95% of the performance, and then you suddenly end up saving like 20% of energy. That's what I want to say.
The idle power consumption is maybe even more impressive at just 18.5 watts.
And that is actually the highest idle power consumption that you will get from any Mac, because the communication layer between the Mac's chips is actually on, right? Unlike a regular chip, you cannot like disable it without like risking like system stability. So this is, for example, why the Mac Mini was always rated at around 10 to 12 watts of idle power consumption. This is actually higher than that.
Charges with more juice than that. Given that we're looking at CPU performance that's roughly 90% of the way to a
relative performance, and they just showed that in code compilation it actually outperforms the it shows that it outperforms that CPU, yet it has only 88% of the relative performance, because that's what Cinebench told them, right? This is so ridiculous.
Core i9.
Like, if it was like 95%, I would understand. Or even if you were to say like it's 1-to-1, there are legit tests that show that like a fully maxed out M2 Ultra is actually faster than a 3900K. But unless you like overclock the 3900K and give it like a full like 6.1 gigahertz clock speeds, then yeah, I do believe that it could be like 5 to 10% faster. But like, this is ridiculous, guys. Like, you cannot say that it's like 12% faster here. It's like the GPU, no, I don't know what test you're using. The 4090 is not double the raw compute power of the M2 Ultra. That's simply not true. The GPU Blender results are actually interesting, because I would put it then like here if you want to just believe your own results. And then productivity, whatever that means, right? You didn't even test enough stuff to even like classify productivity like that. Like, what did you just mean like that one clearly bugged DaVinci Resolve result? Really?
and a GPU that's anywhere from about 30 to all the way as fast as an RTX 4090.
So it's between 30 and 100% as fast, which you should understand how ridiculous that sounds. Again, rendering sucks on Macs. That doesn't actually reflect the raw compute of the GPU. It doesn't actually reflect how the GPU can be leveraged in different applications. So this idea that you're like, oh, on the last version we couldn't even find like something to leverage the GPU. Like, they are like artificial like GPU tests. Like, come on.
This efficiency is nothing short of unbelievable.
Yes, it's
This
amazing.
is what Apple should have been shouting from the rooftop.
And they do. They do. But they don't do it for like every individual product. The M1 Ultra was an absolute revelation in efficiency relative to its performance. Well, efficiency is always relative to performance. It was a revelation in power consumption relative to its performance, which equates in high efficiency. However, the problem now is the Mac Studio, the M2 Ultra Mac Studio just picks up where the M1 left off, and it's better. It's faster. It sometimes will be less efficient because it's higher clock than average. So my point is, this wasn't hidden. Apple advertised this, it for Apple Silicon left and right. Just because you try to focus on like that one benchmark that you didn't like, and then underplay like other benchmarks that you even mentioned, like code compilation, then my question is like, do I trust you fully here?
It's about not cherry-picked benchmarks compared against older hardware.
Yeah, older hardware. Like, yeah, because what do we test? Only, like, Apple doesn't test against PCs. That's not the market they're addressing. They're more likely to compare this against a freaking M2 iPad than they are against a PC, because people like me will not like Windows, and people who do 3D rendering and had to learn to get along with Windows, they are using Windows anyway. And yes, they will sometimes look at Apple at like the latest benchmarks to see if, oh, can I finally switch fully to a Mac? And the result is often no. And then they go along with using a PC.
There is one more claim that we need to verify, though: operating temperature. To do so, we popped the Mac Studio into our handy-dandy environmental chamber.
But those are not claims. Those are more security, like safety things. Like Apple is telling you at which temperatures you use it or not.
GPU load rip. And fortunately, the Mac Studio's thermal design is quite capable of handling the load at room temperature.
Okay.
However, it's worth noting that the system does throttle its performance rather than increase the fan speed beyond 1900 RPM. That means that you could end up sacrificing some performance for lower noise unless you use a utility like TG Pro to auto-max your fans. To simulate a warmer environment, we cranked our ambient heat to 35 degrees, and unfortunately it chokes pretty hard here. That's disappointing compared to the perfect performance we saw from an RTX 4090 at these temperatures. At least the fans do finally push past 2000 RPM, and they do creep a little higher over time. But even after 20 minutes, they never managed to max themselves out, despite the fact that the CPU is obviously throttling. We saw power consumption that was rapidly fluctuating between 215 and 280 watts. So
again, interesting, not fully relevant to most users, but that's what their lab is for. I will not be criticizing it. And yes, I do believe that like Apple's fan curves are sometimes a little weird, and I definitely do agree that in this scenario it should be running at full speed, or at the very least I believe that Apple should have a more native way to manage fan speeds that isn't like TG Fan Pro, which again is also something I use because it's also like a great like thermal monitoring system, and it's nice to play around with.
if you're living in a hotter climate and you don't have air conditioning, don't settle for Apple's auto settings. You're going to want to set an aggressive fan curve. To cap off our thermal chamber testing, we wanted to see if dropping the temperature unlocked a little bit more performance.
No.
So we set it to 10 degrees, roughly fall or spring temperatures around these
No,
parts.
it doesn't.
And the answer is no. Apple will simply maintain the fan at a lower RPM, meaning that you could get quieter operation, but you won't see.
It's actually also like Apple doesn't super highly clock any of their chips, but for example, this year they have been more aggressive. Like there is like a high power mode, like there even was a high power mode. With the M1 generation, like the Max chips, but like the M2 clearly do leverage it a little better. They're like 200 megahertz extra that you get out of it. Apple clearly doesn't like overclocking the Ultra chips at all, probably because the communication layer is like really, really fine-tuned, and overclocking it might introduce stability problems, might introduce latency issues actually. So I wish Apple would have overclocked it just from the get-go by like 10%, especially on the Mac Pro, but it is what it is.
Any more performance, and this is confirmed by the roughly similar peak wattage that we observed compared to our room temperature test. Expansion is an interesting conversation that we haven't touched on yet, though. Almost all of the criticism for the M1 Ultra SoC, aside from our assertion that M1 Max made it a pretty tough sell, and Apple's disproven claims of GPU performance kingship, was centered around the lack of 48 gigabit per second.
No, nothing was this was disproven by you and only by you. Well, people who were like, yes, again, if you were trying to do like rendering comparisons against the 3080 or trying non-native games on Mac, yes, and some will be like, oh, you are making so many exceptions. No, I'm making like 2 exceptions here, which is like rendering and gaming, which I know are some big use cases for PC users. Guess what? I have never rendered like a scene in my life. And I do play games on my console, so I don't care how my Mac performs in those use cases. And I do play a little bit on my Mac. I do use some emulators and stuff like that, even some more powerful emulators, wink wink. But, and it's always enough, even on my M1 Max. But my point here is that those chips might be capable of that, but because of literal decades of those tasks not being the priority for Mac users, and therefore not Apple, and therefore not developers on Mac, that's the difference. Everything else, yes, everything else works well. So yes, I will shit repeatedly on rendering and a lot of, especially like non-native gaming tasks on Mac. I actually do believe that like native games are fair comparison points, and they do often perform very well. They also have a ton of memory at their disposal, so they clearly still aren't built often with Mac in mind, unlike PC versions, which do sometimes have to like do crazy things to optimize for like 8 gigabyte GPUs. So
HDMI and its general inability to drive 8K displays. Well, with the HDMI upgrade and the M2 Ultra's ability to drive up to 3 of those aforementioned 8K panels, those limitations have basically melted away, and if you think about it, there are very few scenarios where this much expansion is not going to be sufficient, especially considering that 10 gigabit Ethernet has been standard since the first Mac Studio. Imagine saying that about an Apple product. Class-leading I/O. I love it. Side note, by the way, it's really strange that Apple neglects to mention that the first-gen Mac Studio also has a high-impedance headphone jack, just like the new one does in the compare page. Archive.org exists, you guys. Come on, that is not a value add for this gen.
Copy-paste issue. Or maybe a little dishonesty. How many people... like, the problem is with claiming that this is dishonesty, which is fine, right? If you look at it on, like, a super objective terms, it's like, oh, they deleted this, right? You will often find that like those comparison pages are not complete, especially for like older generations. And the other point is because they do not match one-to-one like the tech specs side. They are a little more simplified. And the other point is quite simply that who the F buys a Mac Studio and then like the M1 and then upgrades to like the M2 because it has a high impedance headphone jack, because anybody who's actually an audio engineer will use an external DAC.
Speaking of value, there are certainly professionals and prosumers out there who are going to buy this and be happy with it at any price. And I'm not going to mock them for it. I mean, Apple's got their ecosystem, and, perhaps more importantly, they've got applications like Final Cut and Logic Pro.
That you didn't test for some reason. Because if you were actually criticizing Apple for testing it against an old iMac or not testing against PCs, your primary comparison was like, oh, it should be like the last gen. Well, then cross-platform comparison don't matter as much, and now you have to consider testing applications that Mac users actually like using.
So if your workflow requires Apple tools, that is totally valid, and objectively speaking, this is the fastest a Mac can go today, and it's going to be quiet and draw less power than a PC while doing it.
Yeah, by the way, really good that I know some people were like laughing when I said like, oh, like you're running the 4090 of like an external battery. I meant like a portable, like big battery for like external usage for like camping and stuff. That is for like movie shooting and stuff like that outside. That is a big thing. Like in comparison, like the power savings here are enormous.
That's what you're paying for. Same price as last gen, faster computer.
Yes.
What's there to complain about then? Aside from the ridiculously expensive proprietary storage that you can't.
Yes, I can agree with that. It's a fine criticism. Again, this video does not exist to like blindly hate on everything Linus says. So, yeah, I do believe Apple storage prices, like, let's forget even like their PCIe 4 storage prices. Like the fact that their half speed storage is the same price is what really pisses me off. So, don't ever think that I'm again above or below criticizing Apple.
Post-purchase. For everyone else, however, $4,000 US?
Who is everyone else? Because this is a studio device, a pro device. It is not aimed at the gamer guy who got a 4090 to flex and is doing some rendering on the side. By the way, like, let us be fully honest. Like, I will be like a little more like NVIDIA Pro GPU. They've changed some naming. The Quadros. That's the name I couldn't remember. Like, so the RTX 6000 generation, right? Quick specs. So they max out at 48 gigabytes of GDDR6 memory, so not even the fastest memory. They have 4 DisplayPort 1.4 ports. Really, 0 HDMI. That sucks. So it has like, it's connected over PCIe Gen 4. It's 300 watts. So in most scenarios, it will not even like get to the full performance of the 4090, which is at 400 watts. So I want to know what is the pricing. Price Quadro 6000 48 gigabyte. So I know you buy them in bulk, but those cards cost as much as the Mac Studio. The Mac Studio starts with 64 gigs of memory that are addressable by both the CPU and the GPU. It starts with a lesser configured GPU, which this is a lesser configured. It has like more or the same amounts of CUDA cores as the RTX 4090, but it then like clocks them lower to like, because they're meant for like professional machines are apparently always like 300 watt GPUs, not a watt more. I don't know why, but like, even if I buy like one used, like the lowest one is like $5,000, 5,000 euros, and it goes up to like 6K, 7K. Like, why? Like, this is the price that professionals pay for something with less memory, because yes, this for example will be used for like rendering and testing video games and stuff like that. But again, if you actually compare it to what Apple is offering on the Mac Studio, you will actually find that the Mac Studio is far closer to consumer pricing than it is to pro pricing, and it sits right where you would expect like a prosumer product to be.
A lot of money, and that doesn't even get you the top of the line M2 Ultra. That's going to be an extra $1,000 on top, and then another $800 for the 128 gigs of memory.
I have criticized like here I would actually say like the $800 for 64 gigabytes of extra memory that are usable by the GPU are actually not bad comparison to paying $200 for 8 gigabytes on the lower end Macs. And this is clearly only for people who actually need it and are most likely can afford it. So here the prices are actually don't complain about like I do with the storage and a little bit with like the upgrade to the full configuration. But again, the full configuration also exists. The non-full configuration also exists because it technically is the full configuration for, once again, the CPU, the neural engine, and the media encoders. Which also like we live like in the world of AI, not a single like neural engine test, even like to maybe show off the RTX card, right?
We put in ours. Let's put this into perspective. A PC with a Core
3900K, $560, a Noctua fan, Z790, $600 motherboard. Yep.
GeForce RTX 4.
G-Skills Trident. This is 128 gigabytes of DDR5 memory. Yes. 6800. Okay, that's fast. Samsung 9. Okay, the 980 Pro will be slower than what Apple is using, but yes, you can. The storage price difference is ridiculous.
Same capacity NVMe.
The RTX 4090, it's now at $1,600. That's cool. It used to be like much more expensive to get.
SSD.
A Corsair casing, a Seasonic power supply, and a full-priced Microsoft Windows. Okay, that's actually fun.
System memory, actually more if you count the GPU RAM.
Okay, so now we are hitting problem points because it's the same amount of system memory. That's true, though I would probably ask like what CPU tasks do you do that would require 128 gigabytes in comparison to like what GPU tasks do you do that wouldn't even like benefit from like more than 32, because the 4090 has 24 gigabytes, which is far less than even the base configuration. And again, I've told you what the Quadro version with 48 costs like. So I think the more apt comparison would probably be like the Quadro with then 64 gigabytes of CPU memory. So you could save like $300, but then add like $3,000 for the price difference between the 4090 and the Quadro. And some will be like, well, but the Quadro gets like pro driver support and something like that. It really doesn't matter. Like when you test, like for a professional environment where yes, there are other benefits to Quadros, but like if you really just want something with more memory, you are just completely out of luck if you want it on the PC side outside of the professional workspace, and you cannot even get something like you could start combining Quadros, right? To like have like double the memory, though that doesn't always scale well, so I wouldn't even bet on it. So if you really wanted like something that could give you like 128 gigabytes, not even talking about like 196, nothing can compare on the PC side to 196 gigabytes. But like let's say you're using like two Quadros for some kind of super large rendering project, now you're in a completely different price category. So not saying that that's needed, not saying that that is what consumers should care about, but guess what? This is a prosumer to pro level device, especially like the Ultra configuration. And then again, yes, it's an Apple device. It's nicely built. It has macOS with all of its like quality of life features. It has all the ecosystem advantages. That's where Apple then comes in and asks like 10 or even 20% more money. And then you can discuss like how much the base hardware should even cost. But this is not a consideration that people are making who are buying something in that price range anyway.
And even taking into account the cost of the operating system is going to cost $1,722 less. You could quite literally buy a completely overkill PC that most people wouldn't even consider to begin with, and then with the money left over, you could also buy an M2 Pro MacBook or a Mac Mini. That's a yikes.
That's not a yikes. It's actually a legitimate point about like if you're like a rendering professional, you buy a PC, and then you for example something that like Felix Bad, he's a German YouTuber, said that they use a PC for rendering because that's the fastest thing for rendering, but on the go they use basically exclusively MacBooks because the battery life difference to a PC laptop that might even be like 3 or 4 times more powerful because of RT acceleration is still enormous. The quality of life of actual usage is much different because like if you get even like a 32 gigabyte MacBook Pro, right, then you still can work with like 12 or 16 gigabyte projects much better than you can on something that has even just a full 12 or 16 gigabytes of GPU memory, because you can sometimes spill out of that, which won't happen on the Mac because the project will always stay below the 32 gigabytes that you have available. Unless you do like a CPU task on the side, then you buy a 64 gig Mac, or even like 96 gigabytes, which is also available, right? So alright, it's 192 at its peak. I believe I said it's 196. It's 96 and 192.
What, if anything, is going to be the advantage of using Apple's brand new Mac Pro chip?
It's if you need a Mac and you need PCIe expansion. It's that simple. I'm so tired of having this discussion. It's not a great value, no. It's not designed to compete with any like traditional PC. But look at MKBHD's video. He explains it really well.
Over the Mac Studio. The SoC is the same, but the price is $3,000 higher, and there's no support for GPU accelerators in its PCIe slots. Maybe the entire point of that product is to make the Mac Studio seem like a somewhat acceptable value?
It is an acceptable value because it has been widely accepted. Okay, good. Now we're finally finished. Oh god, that was... Well, that was something, right? So now you can see me in full glory. So that was complicated. And as I've said, I don't actually disagree with all of the points that Linus has made. And I have said that, for example, like sometimes the way Apple like structures their website can be misleading. And sometimes the devices they compare something to are not what you want them to compare something to. I'm fine with that. My point, though, is that it's clearly a choice and not as malicious as Linus makes it out to be. Like, oh, the only real like conclusion that you can derive from it is that Apple is basically like lying to you. Is there maybe partially that when you consider like that Linus couldn't replicate those results and Apple maybe should have tested it again? Maybe. And I do not try to be like defensive for a multi-trillion-dollar company. I'm trying to be defensive of the truth. And that's why I'm not attacking Linus for saying, oh, we couldn't replicate those results. Because just as I believe Apple that they were able to create the results they have shown, I do believe Linus that they weren't able to replicate those results. I do not automatically assume malicious intent from actors that I know are somewhat trustworthy. The other point is, now now we do have this discussion of narratives, and the discussion of narratives comes into play because Linus tries to make it look as if Apple wants to create a narrative by showing you the best benchmark up front, obfuscating PC results, and that's it. Right, and there is partially that Apple wants to sell their products, so they will not compare it to PCs. First of all, because that's not what most of their consumers care about, but also because sometimes Apple looks bad in comparison. I absolutely agree with that. However, then Linus proceeds to create narratives of his own by hyper-focusing on those rendering results, which again is not what most of the people do on Macs or in general. I would argue with like just how big YouTube is, like video editing is much larger than rendering, but that's neither here or there. Both deserve to be tested. I'm not downplaying the importance of 3D rendering, but my point is, like, now then you're trying to make like a 4090 comparison, which again is not a card that can fully like match everything the Mac does, and neither can the Mac fully match what the 4090 delivers. The Mac has its unified memory, the RTX 4090 has like the long-term like CUDA and RT support from the PC community, so there are legitimate differences. I would actually love to see like a 4090 running on macOS and absolutely choking. And then there's like then there are narratives based on pseudo narratives that he is like disproving, right? He's like, oh, Apple is like basically telling you, saying you are a moron because they are comparing it to an Intel iMac, and you will eat it, you slog, right? No. Apple is comparing it because it's actually a relevant comparison. That's the same way they could have just compared against the 28-core Mac Pro. But that's also a 3-year-old device with worse single-core performance and also support for like a 5700 XT or like a W5700 XT, I believe it's what it also offered. And then it had like those even higher end GPU configurations, which if we then start talking about power consumption, then we are talking about like an order of a magnitude of difference in power consumption sometimes. So again, Linus really shouldn't make so many Apple videos when it comes to the same freaking issue, which is like, oh, I found this one thing that I disliked. No, please stop. And by the way, this isn't just an Apple issue. I've seen that with like the 4090 when it originally came out, and people were like, oh, the efficiency claims are kind of weird. And then when you actually test it, when you consider like ray tracing or something like that, there are use cases where it legitimately becomes far more efficient. It makes sense. It goes from an 8nm Samsung node to a 4nm TSMC node. So being 2 to even sometimes 3 times more efficient. Like, yes, will it end up 2 times more efficient, much more likely than 3x? Yes. Will there be scenarios where it is 3 times more efficient? And I can understand why marketing teams would want to focus on an up to 3x. Yes, I can also do that. That's why we have testing, reviews, benchmarks, who do their own testing. I do not care about the benchmark that you have found on the website and are now doing like psychoanalysis to see why Apple provided us that benchmark. What I care about is what are users actually using, then testing out those apps in different ways, right? Including what they did like with their video rendering test, which again I was surprised by. For one, it was a buggy result and they didn't bother to like test even like a different version or something. Oh yeah, I have like reactions on. That's actually funny. Like that should also do something, right? I have macOS Sonoma. Okay. Maybe we should end it right here, but like my last point is like Linus didn't test enough. What he tested was sometimes problematic, often unimportant, like all of those rendering tests, like doubling down on them. It's like, and then completely like ignoring something like the code compilation test, which was like the only like real world CPU benchmark they've actually shown. All the others were like synthetics, like Geekbench and Cinebench, but somehow the results in like their graph were then based on like the synthetics and not the actual like CPU test. This video got way too long. I had hoped to make it like half an hour. It's been 2 hours. Guys, what the hell am I doing? I have to go work out now. But Linus, please put your Apple videos on your actual Apple channel. Please ask your actual like Apple-centric employee to what apps people actually use on Apple devices. And then please also try to compare it to actual like ridiculous PC components like server style CPUs and motherboards, how much they cost, which by the way should be the relevant comparison against the Mac Pro, but that's another discussion. And not the 4090, but like more like a Quadro. Again, not even saying that it's like a Quadro could be like $3,000 and then it would be a better value than the Mac Studio. But because Nvidia knows what pros are willing to pay, it's $6,000. And because it's $6,000 or even more sometimes, I have no idea what, like maybe you can buy it in bulk for like a discount, or maybe it's like $4,000 or $5,000, right? Now suddenly it is worse than the Mac Studio in terms of value, unless, and of course, unless you're talking about rendering, right? It's always rendering where people are like, Macs suck because like Octane was worse than on the 4090. Yes, of course. So yes, this was a long video. I've gotten like a little windy, and I've gotten like angry, and I've gotten like sarcastic, and it took me way longer than I expected to. And I'm sweating not because I'm sweaty, but because it's like 100 degrees Fahrenheit outside. And I have like a small like cooling system that's like blowing a little bit of air, but I put it on the lowest level, so I don't like it doesn't interfere with the microphone. I have to end it now. Thank you to anyone who watched like even half of it, or like a quarter of it. I wanted to make like an attractive 30-minute video that people could actually like watch a lot. I think this video will now do nothing. But to anybody who still watched, thank you so much. As always, I'm open for constructive criticism. Please let me know what you want to hear me talk about next. Please let me know what you thought of this topic. Please let me know how you think I should maybe react to similar videos like that in the future. So this was MarkTech, and still is, but only for a couple seconds more before it's workout Mark. Saying thank you so much.